Good, so now we move forward, and now we have a presentation related with some connection with the previous one, because it's also trying to link this research world with the statistics data collection from the classifications and data sources point of view. And for this purpose, we have today the pleasure to have Professor Gereffi to make this presentation. I will, well, probably you know him as well quite well, because he's an institution, I would say, in the analysis of global value chains, so it's well known by everyone. I would simply say that Mr. Gereffi is a professor of sociology and director of the Center on Globalization, Governance and Competitiveness at Duke University, and he has performed a lot of research analysis in global value chains, competitive strategies of global firms, industrial upgrading, and so on. So I will give you the floor, and please go. Thank you.
Good morning. I would like to echo Ronald's appreciation for the sponsors of the meeting, and especially to INEHI for being such a great host and sharing your beautiful facilities, ordering up great weather for us, and in general having a very nice setting for these conversations. So I have two tasks that I want to deal with in my presentation. First, I want to briefly highlight some of the key points that are in a paper written by Stacy Frederick. So Stacy is a researcher at the Center on Globalization that I direct at Duke. Stacy has a PhD from the North Carolina State's College of Textiles, and she has been working on these issues of developing global value chain maps, particularly for textiles and apparel, but for other industries as well, for at least the last 6 or 7 years. And she is incredibly good at it. She's very meticulous. She's very rigorous in how she approaches this, very systematic. So the paper itself that's uploaded, it's dense and it's comprehensive, and those are both compliments. There's a tremendous amount of great material there. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is I'm going to pick up a couple points, a series of key points that she emphasizes. Sorry. And then I want to do something else, which is in the paper, the key sector that's used to kind of illustrate how we develop global value chains and how that can be linked to ISIC data or trade and value-added data or supply use tables. It's all about textiles and apparel, which is an industry that Stacy knows very well. And by the way, one other thing that she does extremely well is she's very committed to online databases for the kind of tools that we're using. And that came up very much yesterday with TIVA, also UN Comtrade. And so one of the things that Stacy has done is she's created 2 websites called Textiles Connect, one for North Carolina, one for South Carolina. She's created another value chain website on nanotechnology in California. And she's also helped a lot at Duke in our North Carolina and the Global Economy website. So another big part of what we're discussing here, I think, is visualization of this kind of data, being able to introduce it to audiences that can make sense of it and can adapt it. So I think that's all part of a package which is in the paper, and it's turning around textiles and apparel. But I want to go beyond that one case in the second part of my presentation and bring up a few other cases where we've used global value chain analysis to analyze particular countries. And I think there are some new opportunities to link the kind of global value chain analysis we have done with the data collection and coordination objectives of this group. So I want to try to anchor our discussion in some possibilities and really look ahead at some things that are happening and show how we could make some progress. So that's kind of the outline. I'll first cover the paper that Stacy wrote, and then I'll give some additional global value chain examples. So in terms of the paper itself, and again, I really encourage people to look through it, Stacy reviews how this global value chain literature or research has evolved over the last 5 to 10 years. It's actually evolved over the last 20 years in different phases. But she does a really good job of showing how there's at least 3 strands of that research that are relevant to our discussions here. One strand comes from the mid-90s, I'd say through the mid-2000s, late 2000s, is by a wide variety of social scientists, geographers, sociologists, political scientists, some economists. Tim Sturgeon's been very active in that. I've been very active, and a lot of our colleagues. And much of that global value chain work has been case study based. People have focused on different industries, global industries. In looking at those global industries, they've tried to identify what the governance structure of that industries looked like, and they focus on a variety of countries in that global industry that are competing with one another. So the 2 core concepts of global value chains, governance and upgrading, get linked in the case studies. But there's a second, newer phase of research that I think is even more relevant to this audience, which is as some of the new data that different organizations have been creating has come online, like the trade and value added and other sources, we're starting to get a new group of economists interested in this. And Stacy calls them in the paper GVC economists. We actually had quite a good collection of them in China over the summer at a global value chain workshop that Ji Wang coordinated with some of his colleagues there. And I think what economists are starting to do very effectively is model global value chain governance structures and implications for countries using much more extensive data than we had in the past. But then a third phase, and this is particularly relevant to this group, international organizations, particularly the data collection agencies, have been trying to figure out how to institutionalize this effort looking forward. So all of those phases of the same framework are outlined very well in that paper. I think the core message is that the theoretical insights that come from the original case study global value chain work would be greatly enhanced by added data availability from the economist and statistics agency. So it's precisely that collaboration effort that I think we're all engaged in here. So in terms of, I'll start with how we do the GVC work, because a critical part of global value chain analysis is something that we call value chain mapping. So if we take any industry, furniture, textiles, information technology, defense, aerospace, a key part of a value chain analysis is you first have to try to create those boxes and arrows that capture the input-output structure of that industry to some degree. Typically, the inputs will start with raw materials, go through key components, maybe then move into sub-assemblies and final product production. But very interestingly, from a global value chain point of view, final product production, a car, an airplane, a dress, is in the middle of the value chain, because then you have distribution and final consumption. And one of the discussions we had yesterday about the role of big retailers and brands, the sort of the global buyers, they're way on the far right side of that value chain. And I think one of the biggest insights of global value chain research is that increasing consolidation on the demand side, the retailers, the supermarkets, the big brands, has actually allowed those companies to organize global supply chains in ways that nobody would have thought possible. That was the reason for the distinction between buyer-driven chains and producer-driven chains. It varies by industry. So part of it is creating those boxes and arrows. And when we do that from a global value chain point of view, what the paper points out, I think very effectively, is there's kind of 3 techniques we use to create a value chain map in the case study world. One, we often start with trade data, depending on whatever industry we're looking at. We look at the trade categories at the 3 or 4 or 6-digit level, however much, and we try to understand who are the main players internationally in terms of trading that good. And we do this typically over time, over 20 years or something like that. Second, and this is more recent, colleagues like Aaron Sider in Canada have really been pioneering good work. You can use input-output tables to actually make connections between the boxes. Because when we're using the trade data, that tells us something about the finished goods and some of the key intermediate goods. But as we'll see in a minute when I give some examples, to do the real supply chain, the input-output structure, we've got 4 or 5 columns of economic activities that have to be linked in a value-added process. And so we can use input-output tables to do that. But third, and very importantly, we use expert interviews. We go to firms in the industry, we show them the value chain maps we're creating, and we also get their feedback as to whether we've got the right categories that are important. And of course, a value chain map can be more or less detailed depending on the use. So we have, that's the input-output structure. The geography of these value chains can vary a lot. They could be global, they could be regional, they could even be national, and what kind of upgrading activities you're trying to focus on. So that's kind of how GVC analysis approaches it. And if you look at this example of the textile apparel value chain, I mean, you can sort of see this in a very schematic fashion. And in the middle, those arrows, that's the supply chain or the input-output structure, going from raw materials to components to final products, distribution and services, and different kinds of end markets. So those end markets can either be organizational end markets, you selling to a big retailer, you selling to a high-end fashion company, you selling online, or they could be geographic markets. There's different ways we can talk about it, but the idea is you've got a supply chain, you've got some value-added functions at the top that are important, R&D, design, production, and so that part on the top in those circles overlaps with what Ronald was talking about from Peter and Tim. We do see functions as a kind of comprehensive set of categories that will vary by industry in terms of their relevance. And then at the bottom, you've got different kinds of supporting institutions. So we kind of typically start out with something very generic, and then we adapt it pretty quickly to the industry in question. So then when you say, what kind of data do we need? We've got all these different sorts of information. Typically, when we are collecting data for the value chain, the one big difference that between a lot of the statistical analysis one sees is that we don't just look at the trade, production, and employment data. Those are important. But we really try to figure out how to get firms and interfirm networks into the value chain map. So that really requires us getting establishment level data, and there's different ways to do that. But all of these kinds of data that are listed there are relevant. So one of the things Stacy did in the paper was to show that if we've got these different kinds of global value chain dimensions on the left, this input-output structure, the geography of the chain, the governance, and different kinds of upgrading, the middle column is where do we currently get information when we do these GVC studies? And it's that combination that I mentioned of trade data, perhaps input-output analysis, and interviews. And on the right, she's got a list of proposed data sources where we might be able to bring in better, more systematic data that's collected by the statistical agencies to shore up some of those measures. So this is kind of the general outline, and then what she does in the paper is go through in much more detail for this particular industry of the apparel value chain, how that might actually work. And apparel is a very interesting, important industry. At one level, it's probably the most globally spread of all export industries. Partly that was driven by the fact that for 35 years, there was something called the multi-fiber arrangement that governed the apparel industry in the US and in Europe, which meant that a lot of countries hit upon quotas, and so production kept getting spread to a larger array of countries. Barriers to entry are relatively low in apparel. It's a fairly low tech industry. So it's been an industry that's highly globalized, and at one level seems like it's labor-intensive, low technology. But at another level, when you look on the right-hand side of that equation, the big retailers, the designers, or the brands, the supermarkets, it's an incredibly technologically sophisticated industry. The logistics required to get fashion cycle garments from 25 countries into stores in one city within a 2-day period are incredible. Walmart made its money primarily as a logistics innovator in terms of things like cross-docking. So logistics is incredibly important. Branding is extremely sophisticated and expensive in this industry, and there's a lot of high technology on the design side. So it's an industry that at the production level has a lot of fairly basic production technologies, but in terms of how the value chain works, there's a lot of high tech and high knowledge activities. So when you look at a chain like this, you see that services account for 70 to 80% of the value added. A little bit like when we used the iPhone example yesterday for China and said, well, iPhone, a very sophisticated product, $450 retail value. Why is it that China's only getting $6.50 for assembly costs? Well, similar things go on here in apparel. You could talk about how much Italian jeans cost at the retail store, and then you could say, well, how much does it cost to actually produce them? And you get these big disparities. So this is what a value chain analysis is trying to identify. It's trying to look at markups, value added, profitability across the chain. And this shows where sourcing or logistics, design, branding, retail, that's where the big money is in this industry. But you've still got incredible coordination and tracking we have to do at the supply chain level. So Stacy then goes on to say that if we wanted to fill in these categories with data that we are available from the statistics agencies, we really need to go down to a 6-digit level. And this is a theme that was repeated yesterday many times. So one of the biggest barriers to use existing data, even coordinated data, for these industry studies is that the level of disaggregation we need to do a really good value chain study usually surpasses the availability of data categories to provide us with that kind of information. But with trade data, at least, you can get pretty close. You can get, and probably with production data. So that's one of the issues. What level do we need for the supply chain up through apparel production, the green box? But then when we get to the intermediaries or the lead firms, those data hardly don't exist at all. I mean, if you look at the biggest company involved in distribution, it's a trading company called Li & Fung. Li & Fung is the world's largest trading company. It absorbed many others. It's Hong Kong-based, China-oriented, but it's all over the world. It coordinates something like 30 or 40,000 suppliers. It works with all the big lead firms. So they're a critical player in the middle of this chain. You've got all kinds of other companies on the retail side. So getting data on those, it's really hard. The data categories are difficult. So what Stacy does is she says, well, if we took those boxes for the value chain, we broke it out a little more. In other words, what would we really want to know in terms of key inputs? So if you think about apparel, you need to know about cotton, you need to know about wool, you need to know silk, a whole lot of synthetics. If you took it back further, the synthetics are related to oil, petrochemicals, et cetera. So it's a really complicated supply chain. So here are some of the boxes and arrows, and what Stacy put in there are some of the NAICS codes, the North American Industrial Classification, that we can get at 6 digits. So one of the things we've been doing increasingly is whenever we create a value chain like this, the first step we do is we try to put numbers, product codes, into the boxes. We don't want to just have an artistic kind of value chain diagram if it can't sit on a database. And so I think we've done better linking it to the data. But I want to point out something in the last column called the textile markets. It's really important in these industries to realize that this kind of a value chain map, it's really talking about market structures and how market structures evolve. When you think about the traditional textile value chain, textiles had 3 main end markets. Apparel was usually the first, automotive was second for all the upholstery, and home furnishings, drapery, rugs, things like that. Those were the traditional big 3. When you look at textiles and apparel today, there's an entirely new high-tech part of the textile industry using advanced materials with totally different end markets. You've got the defense industry. A lot of shirts, jackets, et cetera, have electronic sensors. The medical industry is huge because a lot of textiles now have antibiotic properties. Aircraft industry, a big end industry. Textile fibers are actually part of the skin of airplanes, construction materials, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things we have to do when we think about these value chains is not only look at the traditional end markets, but if we're interested in innovation, we're interested in upgrading, there's a whole set of new markets. So that's part of what she lays out here. And we can come up with codes, but you can see how many product codes you need just for the boxes that she has there. And what she was identifying is that using ISIC data, even with the best available information, we have plenty of empty boxes here. We don't have much information on the inputs. We don't have much information on distribution or retail. So one of the problems is using our GVC method, qualitative and a little bit of quantitative, we can create the boxes, we can create the map, and we can fill in a number of them, especially with firms. But when we go to more traditional data sources, the statistics agencies create, we have missing categories. So there's a data gap, no matter how we look at it. There's a data gap when we get to these kinds of studies, and hopefully the kind of data on services that Tim and Peter are trying to create. And in another paper, Tim Sturgeon has created a really detailed classification of IT services, which I guess was commissioned by Eurostat or somebody else. Those kinds of classifications will be very, very helpful in filling in some of these missing categories. So then this is just another illustration. So what Stacy's doing is taking our global value chain categories, trying to link them to the traditional ISIC categories to show where we have data and where we don't. One of the problems that she highlights about the ISIC data is that it often isn't industry specific. And with all these value chains, if we're doing design, it's got to be specific to the semiconductor industry or specific to aerospace, or if we're going to pull it into the value chain. And we don't have that level of specificity on a lot of the data sources that she was looking at, but maybe people have some suggestions. This kind of brings in the business function focus that Ronald was emphasizing in his paper. We recognize and totally support the importance of bringing in a better way of conceptualizing and measuring business functions because, as we saw earlier, even in a traditional industry like textiles and apparel, 60 or 70% of the value added is services. And when you get into more high-tech industries, the services component is even higher. So we need to be able to find a way to measure services and bring them in. This is that kind of chart that Ronald just showed. So definitely there's a bridge between what the work on GVC service categories is trying to do and the work that the more traditional value chain approach is trying to do. So I just showed this. Ronald's already covered it. Business function surveys are asking the right questions, but critically, we have to be able to link those categories to the other classification systems. So that's the challenge on the business service side. We need to link them to the ISIC or CPC data. We also need to know where value-added activities take place, and that's already, I think, being built into the Canadian and other surveys. But without links to industries, there's not a clear way to use it in GVC studies. So just in terms of Stacy's paper, and this will be my last slide summarizing that, and there's much, much more there that I haven't talked about. New data sets, like the type we were discussing yesterday, offer improvements to help us fill data gaps for GVC analysis. We do need more detailed data, and we have to link data along the chain, and we have to link it to other classification systems. And finally, to the degree we can come up with industry-specific data, we'll be better off in terms of the value chain work. So that's a kind of background on, yes, we can link GVC case study work or value chain work with ISIC and supply use tables, but there's still gaps that need to be filled, and that's part of what we're working on in this meeting. What I want to do now in the second part is let me just give some additional examples that are from recent research we've been doing that I think speak more directly to how or why this work is so important to policymakers and how to make it most useful to them in terms of our efforts here. And I want to start with the governance categories that Michael Connolly mentioned yesterday in his presentation. So he talked about, in my comment to Michael, I said, you know, the initial governance distinction that was made in global value chains was between producer-driven and buyer-driven chains, with the idea that what was new were these buyer-driven chains that started to emerge in the 1970s and 1980s, and were critically responsible for getting Asian countries involved in these global value chains, and Latin American to some degree. Later, we developed a more comprehensive typology, the one that's up here, and just a few points to pick up on yesterday's discussion. On the left-hand side, we've got traditional markets where you have lots of buyers and sellers, and they're linked by price. In today's economy, those markets are harder and harder to find. mean, you have a few spot markets for certain kinds of commodities, but by and large, most international trade has significant market power somewhere along the chain. So markets exist, they're important, but that's not the whole picture by any means. And when you look, I think, at the UNCTAD study, they say 80% of global trade goes through global value chains, however they want to measure it. So there's a lot going on in value chains. The far right side hierarchy is just your vertically integrated firms. That's where ownership really does make a big difference. So if you think about your traditional mining companies, your automobile companies to a large degree, a lot of the capital or technology intensive industries, vertically integrated production networks are how they operate. So hierarchy is quite important in terms of the ownership link. But in the middle, those other three types of value chain governance, modular, relational, captive, they all have lead firms, but the lead firm isn't connected to suppliers by ownership. And that's what we think of as international subcontracting. I mean, that's the world of economic globalization, different from the producer-driven chains. And so I think one thing that's important, yesterday the distinction was made between ownership and control. I mean, a critical part of these global value chain governance systems that are network-based is that lead firms can exert control without ownership. You know, you have these several types and captive relationships. The typical definition is a lead firm. Take the Japanese auto firms, or sort of have a lot of captive suppliers. Toyota would have a set of companies around Southeast Asia or elsewhere that make key parts. Toyota requires that those companies sell the vast majority of their output back to Toyota. So you could say more than 60%. We could put whatever benchmark we want, but a captive supplier is when the supplier is providing well over half of its output to one single client. Modular, relational production is much more information-based. If we think of fashion apparel, the cycles change every 6, 8, 10 times a year. You can't codify that information. So suppliers and buyers are constantly exchanging information. You can't own that very easily. So that's what we call relational. A lot of knowledge-intensive industries are relational. And finally, modular. Tim Sturgeon really pioneered that category with his work on electronics. All the kind of sub-assemblies that are easy to plug and play to multiple assemblers, your keyboards, your hard disk drives, monitors, et cetera, that's all part of modular production. What's interesting about this is we didn't want it to just be a descriptive typology. Yesterday, Michael mentioned that there were 3 key variables we used: complexity of transactions or transaction costs, codifiability, and capabilities in the supply base. When we wrote the theoretical article in 2005, it was Tim Sturgeon, John Humphrey, myself. We wanted it to be useful descriptively, but even more useful predictively. And so we were saying with those 3 variables, they can change and do change in the real world a lot. Capabilities of suppliers go up and down. Codifiability goes up and down. So the idea in a model like this is as those 3 variables change, governance structures change. Why is that important? Because governance structures in these value chains determine upgrading, the ability of countries to move up or to enter a chain or to move up or down the chain. So it's important to see this as a dynamic model. And finally, to just make the point that was mentioned yesterday, these governance structures, they're ideal types, 5 ideal types. They're not meant to characterize whole industries. When we look at global industries, we typically see a mix of these governance structures. If I'm looking at shipbuilding or aerospace, we've got some vertical integration at the top. You might have modular production in the middle. When you get to the bottom of a lot of these supply chains, simple parts, a lot of those are markets. So this is an example that Catherine Dolan and John Humphrey did for Kenya and Zimbabwe just in fresh vegetables. So it's important that real industries have a mix of governance structures. So I just wanted to clarify, yes, we've got control along with ownership, but we have a lot of variety in how we actually apply those governance structures. So I just want to give 3 country examples to finish. And the first 2 are particularly relevant because I'll be followed by a presentation on Costa Rica and another presentation on Mexico. So I want to show how we've been using these value chains in those 2 countries and how I think the data that can be gathered or is being gathered could supplement what we're trying to do on the value chain side. So this is a chart that I know Ronald and others, we've circulated it, and I don't want to belabor the Costa Rica case too much, but I want to make several key points. So 2 years ago, we were asked by the Ministry of Trade, International Trade in Costa Rica, to study 4 export-oriented value chains in Costa Rica: medical devices, electronics, aerospace, and offshore services. And what we were asked to do in those value chain studies is 3 things: show where Costa Rica has come in the last 15 years, 10 or 15 years, show the kind of competition they face today and what are the problems those industries face today, challenges, opportunities, and then where can they go in the next 3 to 5 years? What would be an upgrading strategy? And to do that, we had to create these kind of value chain diagrams. Key thing about this one, so we've got some of those elements, components, assembly, et cetera. But yesterday, the question came up about technology and the role of technology in these value chains. When we look at medical devices, the first thing, and Stacy Frederick worked on this closely, we had to try to find out what export categories exist for medical devices using UN Comtrade. I think we just stuck with Comtrade at the 6-digit level, and those market segment exports at the bottom, and I'm not sure I will get this, but if we're looking down here, yesterday we talked a lot about firm heterogeneity. The fact that when we're looking at firms, it's important if we're talking about exporters or non-exporters. When we do value chains, we have very significant market heterogeneity in every one of these value chains in terms of their segments. So when you look at medical devices, it turned out there are 4 main segments in the medical devices industry. One are called, these ones here, disposables, single-use items, things like syringes, plastic tubes, surgical gowns in some cases. Second, we had surgical instruments. So those are things that are made of specialty materials like surgical forceps. So they're higher technology, they can be reused, but they're basically straightforward instruments. A third category are these things called therapeutics. That's any product you can put inside the human body, a pacemaker, any kind of orthopedic or cardiovascular valves, even hearing aids would all be, and that's kind of a big growth area, much more technologically complex. And then finally you have capital equipment, things like MRI machines. So when we look at this industry, the very first step we had to do was to say if we have 4 types of medical devices, they're actually arrayed on a technology spectrum. The lowest tech items are disposables, higher tech instruments, et cetera, up to the capital equipment being the most sophisticated. So when we did the analysis for Costa Rica looking back, and we looked at their exports, we didn't just ask what were the total exports of medical devices. It was absolutely critical to give this segmented approach where we can say to what degree is Costa Rica moving towards more high technology exports within this sector. And so those upper 3 boxes give us a kind of the technology content of exports. And this isn't a new distinction. Sanjaya Lal, back in 2000, introduced a very useful classification about the technology content of exports. But we couldn't stop here, and this is a big point I just want to make about this case. I said earlier, global value chain analysis is different from TIVA or other things because we have to bring firms into the equation. So one question is, how do we explain this pattern? Suppose it's true, from the data, that Costa Rica has been increasing the technology content of its exports. We had to go to firm-level data, and so what we had done in this study is we interviewed, I think Costa Rica has about 60 or 65 main firms in medical devices. We interviewed about 35 of them. And in those interviews, we asked, why did you come to Costa Rica? What do you do here? How did your product profile change over time? And when we did that analysis, one thing that came out that Costa Ricans hadn't really thought about before was that you've got this kind of wave effect in terms of when firms came into the industry. The first set of companies that came into Costa Rica's medical device industry did disposables, the simple things. The second wave of countries moved to the higher tech medical instruments. A third wave moved to therapeutics. And when we talked to the companies, it was very clear that each wave was talking to the previous set of companies. How do you like it in Costa Rica? You know, why did you come? And by the time we get to this most recent period of 2008, 2012, the companies coming in are doing all of these technology activities. So Costa Rica had great success in kind of moving up a technology ladder, not just in terms of trade data, but in terms of firm profiles. This has created a problem because as the newer companies have come in with higher tech facilities, there's a crowding problem. One of Costa Rica's biggest bottlenecks is they don't have enough space in the Central Valley to accommodate all these companies. And ideally, they'd like to substitute some of the higher tech firms for the lower tech. And you have to say, how do you do that? I mean, Korea, when they were exporting footwear to the world, you had to have an export permit. When Korea wanted to move from footwear to electronics, they just stopped issuing footwear permits to companies and said, you can't export shoes anymore. You have to move into other technologies. China did the same thing when they pushed higher tech, low tech industries to the inner provinces to create space for higher tech. So that's a kind of a challenge. But the point here is, how could we get this data using other sources? Ronald has often talked about business registries and things like that. So this was very labor intensive, obviously. If you're going to do 35 or 45 or however many interviews to find out how and why companies participated in these value chains, you can't do that easily for a lot of countries. So an open question for the audience is, can we use firm level, any kind of firm level data sources to allow us to kind of supplement a list like this? And from our research, we were able to go inside every one of those companies, this is an example of one of them, and ask them what their experience was in Costa Rica, what their technology upgrading looked like. So from this case, 2 points. 3 points. One, we do need to look at technology content of exports and global value chains. We try to do it. 2, we need to bring firms into the picture to understand what's driving the industry. 3, what data sources could we use? Since Ronald and his team, and we'll hear about it when Manfred presents, there was a parallel effort to our study to integrate a lot of data sources in Costa Rica. We've never really linked the integrated data with these value chain studies on 4 sectors, but one way to try to figure out how far could we go by linking the qualitative survey-based work that we do on global value chain case studies with the quantitative data. To me, this is kind of low-hanging fruit. We've got a country that's participated in both. So that's one open question for the audience. Second, let me just switch to Mexico, because Costa Rica, in some regards, like most smaller countries, is a relatively easier case when we're doing global value chains. If we're doing any of the 4 value chains I mentioned, electronics, aerospace, medical devices, offshore services, typically those firms are concentrated in one place in the country. It might be the capital, it might be some key outlying area. What happens when we come to a bigger country like Mexico? Every industry, first of all, Mexico's got an incredibly diversified economy in terms of both manufacturing industries and mining industries, but any industry we look at in Mexico has multiple production clusters. So I think a challenge for value chain work going forward is when we're working in countries like Mexico, Brazil, China, or any of the larger countries, we have to be able to somehow link the multiple points of production inside a particular industry like automotive or aerospace with the broader global value chain tools. So this is kind of I think the next wave of value chain work, where it's trying to accommodate what we know about local clusters, production areas, like the Nissan plant here in Aguascalientes, but there's another big auto plant in Hermosillo for Ford that makes engines, and there's another huge Volkswagen plant in Puebla, and Ciudad Juarez has a lot of R&D. So right there, we've got 4 really substantial automotive production clusters in Mexico. They're all part of the automotive value chain. How do we link them to what we could say in general about Mexico? We can't average numbers. It doesn't make sense to sort of say, what's the average value of Mexico? So we have to link the local clusters with the national value chain with what I think is a regional and a global perspective. And it turns out that right now we have an opportunity. So the Mexican government has a Plan Nacional de Desarrollo for the next 5 years, 2013 to 2018. They've classified sectors into the categories that are mentioned up there. Mature sectors like textiles and apparel, or steel, furniture. Dynamic sectors like automotive, aerospace, electrical, electronic, chemicals, and what they're calling emergent or the highest tech sectors like medical devices, information technology. And in each case, they feel that those types of sectors can contribute in a different way to the overall development process of Mexico. What Mexico would like, so they're currently agreeing to a big 5-year loan with the Inter-American Development Bank that would start next year, 2015. Mexico would like to try to find a way to analyze global value chains and clusters that could help the country implement this development plan in a more effective fashion. So I've been involved with the Inter-American Development Bank in some of the meetings with the Mexican government, the Secretary of Industry and Trade. And so one thing we're proposing, and this is to get feedback from the group, eventually Mexico wants to look at 20 or 25 different value chains. And each value chain has multiple clusters over 5 years. So if we're thinking from a policymaker point of view, that's the challenge. What kind of information can be provided to Mexico? Obviously, to do that many chains and clusters, we need to use quantitative data. We need to use existing data, but also they want to be able to link chains and clusters. So we're going to try to do, the proposal is to do 3 pilot studies, take one industry of each type, textiles, apparel, automotive. Actually, we've changed automotive probably to aerospace, and automotive or aerospace, and medical devices. And so what I wanted to just outline is what that would mean in terms of what this group is trying to do. Because it seems to me that the data categories for clusters and chains are identical. In other words, if you look at the aerospace industry in Mexico, you can have this kind of map that'll show that the aerospace industry has production facilities in various parts of the country. In each part of the country, we know which cities are involved and we know which companies are involved. How would we aggregate that up to a kind of analysis of the aerospace industry more generally in Mexico? It seems to me, back to my approach, we have to look at different clusters. So if you go to Querétaro, where Bombardier has a plant, that's a very integrated value chain. Bombardier has lots of suppliers. If you go to Baja California, it's assembly, parts supply, 2 different parts of the chain. If we look at the automotive value chain, and this goes to the point about regional integration, Mexico has various key automotive production centers, often anchored by different multinationals. But the US has different production centers and Canada has different production centers. So one of the arguments that global value chains, the literature has been making, is that increasingly we've gone past the era of fragmentation to the era of not global value chains, but regional value chains being critical drivers of competitiveness. So I think in Mexico's case, if they're going to try to make a competitive automotive industry or competitive aerospace industry, they have to link what Mexico does with what US and Canada do. But we have to do it at a subnational level. So the question is, could we look at the auto clusters in Mexico? We'd have to characterize them in terms of a value chain. So if I'm doing an automotive value chain map, and I wanted to say a place like the Nissan plant here that's going to be making most advanced Nissan cars, or the Puebla plant, they're really doing high value end product production. And Hermosillo, they're doing engines. And Ciudad Juarez, they're doing R&D. So different clusters can play different roles in a chain. How do we link that to the fact that those clusters have relationships to counterpart clusters in the US or in Canada? So I think we need to have a framework that somehow links clusters, national and international levels of analysis. I think this project would give an opportunity to do that. The question is, from a data point of view, are there problems in linking the subnational entities with national chains and linking Canada or Mexico data with US data, which I mentioned to Bill? Very final point, and I'll be quick here, just to illustrate the US. Somebody mentioned yesterday that as interesting as GDP is to policymakers, jobs are far more important. Employment is far more important. So we've got a website that we did at Duke on North Carolina and the global economy, and I was asked to give a briefing to the North Carolina congressional delegation in Washington 2 weeks ago about North Carolina. And I just want to use this to illustrate for a final time how we do our value chain analysis. North Carolina has been the leading producer in the US of furniture, textiles, and tobacco for the last 3 decades. All those industries are in decline. Employment is plummeting. So when we do a value chain analysis of furniture, one thing we can do, I mentioned that we do our value chains and we link them to databases by using NAICS codes. With those NAICS codes, we can say for every category under furniture, how many employees, how many establishments, what's the average wage. So we have data that policymakers might care about. But more interesting is how do you compare North Carolina to other states in the US that are the other leading furniture producers? Because when North Carolina policymakers are wondering about this industry or biotechnology or IT, they definitely want to do comparisons between states and between countries. So this goes back to my Mexico point. We can't look at an industry in one place. For big countries, we have to look at that industry or that value chain in multiple places. So if we look at this map in terms of total employment, North Carolina is number 1. California is number 2, Texas number 3, and so on. Here again, we have a segmentation by industry type. Home furnishings, I think, is in the blue. Sort of household, office is red, and other furnishings is in the middle. But when we look at the same thing in terms of wages, it looks totally different for North Carolina. North Carolina's wages are much lower than any of its competitive states. And imagine we were doing Mexico versus the US. The same, from a value chain point of view, these comparisons are critical. So one of the things Aaron Sider and I have worked on is we said, when North Carolina looks at its place in the US economy, manufacturing is something like 20% of North Carolina's GDP, state GDP. National average is 11%. And when you look at manufacturing wages, North Carolina is about $8,000 less. Is that good news or bad news, was the question for the congressional people. They'd say, well, the good news side is North Carolina is cheaper. The bad news side is maybe we're losing North Carolina's workers are taking a hit in terms of quality of life. So this became an analytical issue, and what we did using input-output tables for North Carolina is we analyzed the source of the wage gap, and we said the right column here, the wage rate, about half of the gap is because North Carolina's wages are lower than other states, partly because North Carolina is a right-to-work state. They don't have many unions, and they have other reasons why cost is low. But a big part of the reason is this thing called industry composition. North Carolina has fewer high-tech industries than other states. Higher tech industries have higher skills, higher wages. So a big part of what North Carolina is trying to do is attract higher tech industries to move the wage rate up, not just push the wages up for no reason at all. And so then we find, and this will be my last slide, we said, if you take this approach at a 4-digit level, we can map out North Carolina's mix of industries into those that are low wage, low employment in terms of national average, and then low wage, high employment, et cetera. What North Carolina wants is that left column. They want the higher wage industries, and these industries in the lower right, those are the traditional sources of North Carolina's competitive advantage: furniture, apparel, and textiles. Lower left, North Carolina has some of those industries. Upper left, they don't have. That's like aerospace. So the point again is using this value chain approach at a local level, states can come up with policy recommendations like these that are saying to close your wage gap would improve wages. Higher productivity is a key, but to get higher productivity, you need a better mix of industries. I mention this because we can do the same thing for countries. We can do the same thing for Costa Rica. We can do the same thing for Mexico. And very importantly, intra-US comparisons are important, but GVC competitiveness, I think, needs to be defined at the regional level. So my plea is, when we're doing value chains for bigger countries, how can we integrate multiple clusters within a particular value chain and the value chain analysis at the national level using the data we have at our disposal? Thanks very much.